Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf Ayin Daled Shavua Tov. This week's learning is dedicated by Carolyn Hochstadter, Adam Dicker, and family on the 17th year outside of Fred Hochstadter, Ephraim Ben Caleb Baruch this Monday, 8th of Elul. Dad was a Holocaust survivor who was saved by her kinder transport, came to Canada, and met Ma in Montreal. Together, they built a family, business, community, and legacy of support and love for Medina Israel. We missed you and are managing to catch up on some of your reading material, including Menachem Elon's Mishpat Ivri, to which Hadran's daf Yomi has given so much background and context. Continue to laugh at your jokes and follow your wise guidance. And also in honor of today's Pidyon Ben of our first Farber grandchild, Zachariah Ami, Zach. Saba and Safta would be proud. Today's daf is sponsored by Rachel Chefetz in commemoration of her husband's Aryeh Lev Ben Yehuda Lenny Chefetz's 33rd yahrzeit. We were taken much too soon, but I thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the time we were blessed with your smile, goodness, sense of humor, and love. Yehi Zichro Baruch. Today's daf is sponsored by Emma Rimberg for Refuah Shlema for her son Joseph Yitzchak Nisan Ben Chama Leah Esther, who is having surgery today to repair a broken femur after a bike accident. Refuah Shlema. Okay, one other announcement, which is our siyum is in 2 days, Be'ezrat Hashem. We have 2 siyums on the same night, back to back, so pay attention. The English one is at 7 p.m. Israel time. The Hebrew one is at 8:30. The program is, I'll finish the last stuff as usual and have a perspective on the Masechet. Then we're going to hear from a psychologist who's also a daf learner, who's going to speak about ethics and psychology and Lifnei Iver, Kaya Eisenberg. And we're going to have Terry Kravosha will share her siyum hashas with us and some words about that special moment. If you want to join the Hebrew, there's a Shiur from Shiur Brasavenkin from Migdal Oz, also known as Shiri Himmelfarb, now with a new married name, between Man Ben Avodah Zarah Avodat Hashem. And we're going to hear a very special, anybody wants to join, Shiri Dishon is a learner of ours who lost a son in Aza in 2023, I think it was, an Eitan Dishon. And she is going to speak about how loss of my son, or how my son basically, Eitan Rishon Zichrono Livracha, pulled me into learning Daf Yomi, gave me the merit to learn Daf Yomi. So if anybody wants to hear her words, that will be at the Hebrew Siyum, which will be just before the English, just after the English one. Okay, we will get started. Enough announcements. Started with our daf. So we start with a Mishna at the top of our daf, kind of a continuation of what we were doing in the previous daf, which is we learned about Min Bimino and how if you put 2 of the same items together, they're in specifically yayin nesech, right? Yayin b'yayin, and then we had a whole question: is it all these room shebetoha, or everything is oser b'mashu? Now, this idea of oser b'mashu basically means that any sort of mixture, the whole thing is forbidden. There's no laws, even though we know about all these laws of nullification. There's certain situations where laws of nullification don't kick in. So our mission is going to talk about that in a more broader sense and bring examples of cases where things are forbidden b'mashu. So the Mishnah starts off, Elu asulin v'oslein b'kol shehu, exactly this. These are things that are forbidden, and we're going to see they're all forbidden to benefit from, not just to eat or that, but also benefit, meaning you can't sell them and get the money for it and use the money like we saw the whole yayin nesech thing. But these are not, we're not talking about the Isur on itself, we're talking about a mixture where there was something forbidden mixed up with something permitted. These are forbidden and oslim b'kolshu. They forbid in any amount. Okay, here comes our list. Yayin nesech, that's our topic. Okay, yayin that was offered as a libation, wine that was offered as a libation to Avodah Zarah. Now Rashi says here, when we talk about that it's oslim b'kolshu, and you know, Rashi says we mean afilu be'elef lo batil, even in 1,000, right? It's an exaggerated amount. It's not nullified. Rashi says we're talking about chavit be'elef chaviyot. We're talking about a barrel of wine that's a complete barrel of wine that's yayin nesech that gets mixed up with 1,000 other barrels of wine. Okay, we're not talking about yayin b'yayin. We're there. Maybe we could talk about, again, that we saw the whole sugya, min b'mino and all that. Maybe not, but specifically this Mishnah is talking about, we're going to see in a minute, they're going to call this, or in the Gemara in a few minutes, they're going to call it davar shebeminyan. It has to be something that can be counted, that can be measured. Okay, as opposed to a few drops of wine that fall into other wine, that's not a measurable item. We're talking here about a barrel mixed up with 1,000 other barrels. That is definitely, one barrel will never be nullified because it's what we call a davar chashuv, has significance. Okay, when we learn about laws of nullification, it comes up in all sorts of sugyot. Like there's a birya, for example, right? Like a whole bug, even though it's teeny, but it's a bug. It's a complete creature. So because of that, it's a complete creature. That's not going to be batel. So there's all sorts of things that give things significance. So here Rashi claims, not everybody agrees with this, but that specifically we're talking about whole items. I mean, the truth is they do kind of agree with it because they're going to call it davar shebeminyan in the Gemara, but perhaps this way to understand the Mishnah not like this, but certainly the way the Gemara understands it, the way Rashi understands it, according to the Gemara, is that we're talking about complete items like a whole barrel and not a few drops of wine. Avodah Zarah. So Rashi says, what are we talking about? To fit in with what he's been saying, it has to be an idol, that like an object that was worshipped as an idol, that gets mixed up with lots of other objects that weren't worshipped as idols, okay, that maybe could have been turned into idols, but they weren't. Orot levuvin. Orot levuvin is the, if you remember, it's the hide of the animal where there's a circle shape taken out where the heart is, right? A hole right there where the heart is. So that was what they would do for Avodah Zarah purposes. So again, it was something used for Avodah Zarah, and this is mixed up with other ones and, gets confused what's what. Vishor haniskal. Okay, now we get off the topic of Avodah Zarah. The first three related to idol worship. Now we're completely off the topic, and we're talking about all sorts of other things that you can't benefit from, okay, even though we don't yet know that it's all forbidden for benefit, but we're going to see in the Gemara is going to say there's certain criteria to have made it into our Mishnah, and that's why they're going to discuss why aren't there other things mentioned in our Mishnah, why only these? There's certain criteria, and then ultimately we're going to see, I'll already tell you because it's easier to understand the Mishnah in that sense. It's number one, davar shebeminyan, can be counted as an object. Number two, it's forbidden to benefit from. So shor haniskal, this is a shor that gored a person and killed a person. And the shor was judged, sentenced to death, and hasn't yet been killed. And now it gets mixed up with a lot of other oxen. So we basically say all of them you can't benefit from because it's never batel. Egla arufa, right from the parsha this yesterday. The egla arufa, right? They take when they're not sure someone died in between two cities, you measure, and then you take this calf and you break its neck. So that is also forbidden to benefit from. So if the egla rufa gets mixed up with other egla, they're all forbidden. Sipurei mitzorah, this is in the purification process of the leper. It's actually a machlok between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. There's two birds that are taken, and the machloket is which is forbidden b'hana'ah. Is it only after one is slaughtered and one is set free? So Rabbi Yochanan says it's just the one that's slaughtered after it's slaughtered. That's forbidden. And even though it says tzipurei in plural, they mean the one tzipor of the tzipurei mitzorah, right? The one bird, the one that's slaughtered. Rish Lakish is actually both are forbidden to benefit from the time that they're designated until the time that you finish the process. Okay, once you set the bird free, obviously it can't be forbidden to benefit from because then every bird could be, who knows, maybe it's one of those birds. But for that time period, if then it runs away, right, and gets mixed up with other birds, all those birds are forbidden. That obviously creates a huge problem because, right, if it's the dead one, fine. Like now we have a dead bird, right, a slaughtered bird that was now mixed up with other slaughtered birds, so we're going to forbid them all. If it's a live bird, according to Rish Lakish, it's very hard to understand this Mishnah because then any bird flying around could be one of those birds, right? Any bird in the world, really. Se'ar Nazir, the hair of the Nazir. Hair of the Nazir, Rashi points out that it has to be burned under the fire, according to the Torah, because it has to be burned under the fire. We understand there it's forbidden to benefit from. So it gets mixed up with other hair, it would be a problem. This is again in the final process of the Nazir shaves off all the hair. Upeter chamor, this is the firstborn donkey. It's supposed to be redeemed with a sheep. Before it's redeemed, it's again forbidden to benefit from. Basar b'chalav. Okay, this is a very strange one. Meat and milk. Meat and milk is never batel. What do you mean? Isn't that like whenever you think of batel b'shishim, right? 1 in 60, you always think of milk falls into children, right? And it's batel b'shishim. So what could this be talking about? So Rashi points out, similarly to what Rashi said earlier, we're talking about a piece of meat that a lot of milk fell into, gave it enough taste that it was forbidden, and now we have this forbidden piece of meat that gets mixed up with other forbidden pieces of meat. Okay? And then we all know, right, Basar b'chalav is written 3 times in the Torah. One teaches Asur, right? One of them particularly, we'll just focus on the one, which is it's forbidden to benefit from. So you can't benefit from it. So again, it fits into this category, and it would be a case where it's already been forbidden because it wasn't batel b'shishim, and then that piece gets mixed up with other pieces. V'se'ir hamishtalech. Now you might note in the Gemara, if you're looking inside a regular Gemara, there's a little letter by the se'ir hamishtalech. Se'ir hamishtalech is the scapegoat on Yom Kippur that gets thrown off the cliff. Most Girsot of the Gemara don't have this in the Mishnah, okay? But we can have it, we can read it, it's forbidden, and again, if it gets mixed up with other ones, it's a problem. but most people don't have this in the Mishnah at all. Chulin shenishchatu b'azara. This is if you bring in a regular animal, not a sacrificial animal, but a regular animal and slaughter it in the Azara, which is where they did the slaughtering of all the sacrifices, that's forbidden to benefit from. So if you did that and then it got mixed up with all sorts of others, it would be a problem. And the Mishnah ends with the same words it started with, which is going to beg the question, why repeat this? These are forbidden and forbid in any amount. So they're never nullified. Comes the Gemara and wants to know the main issue of the Gemara is what's in this list, what's out of the list, why, how did they choose what went in, what didn't go in. So we're going to have two different things going on here. One is Tanamai Kachashiv. So what's the Mishnah listing? They're trying to come up with a categorization, which I kind of ruined it for you because I already told you from the beginning, but they're trying to think, okay, what's the common denominator between all these things? If it's just things that can be counted and are significant in and of themselves, and they're just forbidden items, forbidden even just to eat. So you should add nevela to the list. Now, if you remember nevela, which is an animal that wasn't slaughtered properly or just died, so that is not forbidden to benefit. You're allowed to sell it to a non-Jew, remember? Give it to your dog to eat. You can benefit from it. Give it to the ger toshav. So we talked about that not very long ago. So that should be in the list because it's a significant item and it's forbidden to eat. And and if you say, well, that's because it's not asur b'hana'ah, we're listing only things that you can't benefit from. Well, why don't you say chametz b'Pesach, which is asur b'mashu? Everybody knows that, right? We all know that's why we're so strict about Pesach, because any little amount of Pesach, right, of an item, some crumbs fall into something, right, it forbids. So that's why we have to kosher everything, because even a little bit of taste gets in, it's a problem. So Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba v'item Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. Okay, one of them said this. Hi Tana Tarti. Like our Mishnah, the Tana of our Mishnah chose two. It had to have two criteria. Davar shebeminyan ve'isurei hana'ah, and that's why chametz pesach is out because it's not davar shebeminyan. It's just some crumbs, and nevela is out because it's not forbidden to benefit from. But now the Gemara says, okay, that doesn't resolve everything though, because there's more things that should have been in our Mishnah. You might remember that orla and kilei kerem, remember? Orla is forbidden to benefit. That's fruits the first 3 years on the tree. Kilei kerem, if you plant your vines right next to your crops in the ground, right? That is also forbidden to benefit from. So why aren't, for example, they're specifically talking about orla, but I mentioned kilei kerem because it's going to come up in a minute. Egozei perech, the rimonei badan, perech and badan are places. And this was where the best pomegranates were from and the best walnuts were from. So the walnuts of Perech and the Rimonei Bidan, why aren't those mentioned? Those are significant items. They're davar shebeminyan, they can be counted, and they're forbidden to benefit. They have all the criteria of the Mishnah, and yet they're not in the Mishnah. So it's kind of knocking the whole theory here. To davar shebeminyan v'isurei hana'ah. To which they answer, okay, there's a different reason why the Tana didn't list them. Hatan ale hatam, they're already listed in a Mishnah in Orla. And there, they don't bring you the whole Mishnah. Okay, you can look it up. It's Perek Gimel Mishnah Zayin in Orla. And there it lists the Rimodei Badan, it goes the Perech, and it lists a whole bunch of other things that grow in the ground, like stalks of cabbage and other things that are significant. And it says there that they're not batel. Okay, they're not batel at all. Okay, there's no laws of nullification. They're swim b'mashu. And it says there, they just quote you part of this, basically, it starts at the list of fruits, and then it starts at the list of things that grow from the ground, and just lists them as if it's one list, and then it just tells you, oh, the ones that are potential orla are forbidden because of orla. The ones that are potential kilayim are forbidden, the potential kilei keren are forbidden because of that. Okay, and then that's basically the Mishnah, and they're already mentioned there. So there's no reason for the Mishnah to mention them here if it already mentioned them there. Okay, it's not necessarily true. Sometimes the Mishnah repeats, especially here, they bring the whole long list. It would have made sense to add, but here's at least a reason. It's listed somewhere else. Now the Gemara asks a question, which I had some difficulty with. I'll explain to you what my difficulty was, but we'll get there in a minute. If we're talking about something of significance, and we said chametz b'Pesach, what was the issue? It's not a davar shebeminyan. But there is something that's chametz, that's a davar shebeminyan, and that has significance. What's that? Homemade bread. Homemade bread, we're going to see that Rabbi Akiva and the Mishna in Orla there lists it as something of significance. Okay, there the context is kilayim because it grows from the ground. If the wheat grew from the ground together too close to, and it was mixed breed with the vineyard, then you made bread out of it, it would also be on that list of not batel olam because it has significance. It's a loaf. And it seems to be that the loaf of bread made by an individual, according to Rabbi Akiva anyway, has significance as opposed to, let's say, a loaf from a bakery, which has less significance. So there would be a case of chametz bepesach, which is a davar shebeminyan, and it's a asur b'hana'ah, and that would be, right? That would be a good example. Now, what's exactly a case of this? That it got mixed up with other things, because what, it got mixed up with matzah? I mean, you would know the difference, right? When we talked about yayin nesech mixed up with other barrels of wine, there was no way to know which wine was kosher, which one wasn't, right? Which one was offered as a libation, which wasn't. Chametz Pesach is kind of noticeable. Maybe it means chametz after Pesach, like it was chametz that you left over Pesach, which is forbidden to benefit from also, and then it got mixed up with other breads. That would be, I guess, the logic of what they're talking about. So why isn't that mentioned in our Mishnah? To which the Gemara answers, Man Shamala D'Amrala, who's the one who says that Kikarot Balabayit have significance? Rabbi Akiva and Hatana Lehatam. And that actually appears in the Mishnah in Orla, again saying, well, then there's no reason to repeat it here. How is it mentioned there? It's actually not mentioned in the context of Chametz Pesach. It's mentioned in the context of the Kilei Kerem, as we see. But the assumption is if it's mentioned there already, as it's not batel, because it's significant, you could obviously know then to our Mishnah that it would obviously be also as regards Chametz Pesach, this would never be nullified, and therefore it didn't need to list it because it was obvious from the other Mishnah, even though it's not exactly the same thing. But basically, here's the quote, Rabbi Akiva Mosif, he adds to the list, not just all these things we listed before, the fruits and the things growing from the ground, but he lists Ab Kikarot Balabayit. Okay, even loaves of bread made from the Balabayit, that would also be never batel because they're of significance. And then you can apply that to Chametz Pesach and say, well, from there you would know, and that's why there was no need to mention it in our Mishnah. Okay, these aren't the most convincing answers, but it's sort of taking a Mishnah and saying, why did the author include these, not include these? There could be other reasons. Hare Elu. Now we get back, before we finish this Mishnah, the last line in the Mishnah seems totally redundant. It repeated the first line. So the Gemara, could be, you had a long list. They want to remind you what we're up to, but the Gemara likes to say, no words are unnecessary. Limiute mai, what does this come to exclude? Limiute davar shebeminyan v'la b'surei hana'ah. Inami limiute isur hana'ah v'lo davar shebeminyan. This is just a repeat of what we said, but they want to tell you that it's coming to exclude, okay? These are forbidden b'hana'ah, never batel, but there's other things that are. What would that be? If it's significant, but it's not forbidden to benefit from, right? Like nevela, that would be batel. Okay, that does have laws of nullification. Or isur hana'ah, but not davar shebeminyan. Okay, like something that's just, like the wine in the wine fell into the wine, theoretically, that could be nullified in certain circumstances. So with that, we finish our Mishnah and we're moving on to the next. Nesech shenafal lebor kulo asur b'hana'ah. So now they say yayin nesech that falls into a pit. Okay, this does seem to say that min b'mino, wine into wine, actually is never, right? The whole thing is forbidden to benefit. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, yimacher kulo la'ovei kochavim chutz mitmei yayin nesech shebo. We mentioned this on Daf Ayin Bet. The Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is a big heter. So yayin nesech falls into your whole barrel of wine, ruins the whole thing, but there's a solution. What's the solution? Sell the barrel, deduct the amount of yayin nesech that fell in, and then you're not benefiting. It's not. The whole thing becomes forbidden, but only because of the yayin nesech that's in it, not because the entire thing is actually forbidden to benefit from. So Rabban Shimon, that's at least Rabban Shimon Gamliel thinks this, not it, right? The rabbis seem to not hold by this. They think the whole thing's forbidden. But comes Rabban Shimon Gamliel and says, no, you can actually sell what was forbidden, what was permitted, deduct the amount of wine that fell in that was forbidden. So now we already saw this on Daf Ayin Bet that Amarav halakha Rabban Shimon Gamliel chavit b'chavit avalo yayin b'yayin. Again, we get back to this distinction: one barrel mixed up with many barrels, or wine falling into one barrel of wine, where we have one barrel with a combined mixture. So Rav says, and we saw this previously, that he doesn't hold it. So Rabban Shimon Gamliel says it across the board, but he holds that it only works if it's a whole barrel of yayin nesech mixed up with 100 other barrels. So sell them instead of for 100, sell 101 barrels for the price of 100. But if it's wine mixed up with wine, it's all because what happens? The whole thing is combined together. We don't view it as a significant as a separate thing. We don't allow this heter. However, we're going to see a slew of rabbis, both in Israel and in Babylonia. Remember, the ones in Israel are quoted by the name of Rebbe, and as opposed to the ones in Babylonia, which either don't have Rebbe at all or just have Rav. Shmuel Amar. So you're going to see, we're going to go Shmuel in Babylonia, Amar, Afilu yayin b'yayin, v'chein Amar Rabba bar Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that's in Israel, Afilu yayin b'yayin, v'chein Amar Shmuel bar Natan, Amar Rabbi Chanina, also a quote from someone from Israel, Afilu yayin b'yayin, v'chein Amar Rav Nachman, going back to Babylonia, Amar Rab Ravua, Afilu yayin b'yayin. So these four rabbis all permitted Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's heter, even wine that got mixed in with wine. Okay, could be sold at a lower rate, deducting the amount of yayin nesech that fell in. Obviously, if you don't know exactly, so you estimate a little more. Okay, if you know exactly, like the barrel case is much easier. When it's wine mixed up with wine, you have to make sure you know how much wine there was, but you can always just figure out somehow or add some extra, deduct some more money. However, even though Rav Nachman himself quoted someone as saying, even yayin b'yayin, Rav Nachman himself, though, when he paskind, Rav Nachman, halacha l'maaseh, if you want to know how to do this, though, nesech, yayin b'yayin aser, chavit mutar. Stam yayin, afilu yayin b'yayin mutar. We get back to this distinction between stam yayinan and yayin nesech, which we haven't talked about in a while. But the difference between wine that we know was offered as a libation, that he's going to be more strict about. That he's going to go in the end like Rav, and he's going to say, yayin b'yayin doesn't work to sell in this way. If you know that the idolater offered it up as a libation and you saw them do it, it was clear, then we're not going to be lenient here and allow you to sell that whole mixture. But stam yayin, if you're just not sure it was a wine that an idolater came in contact with, but you have no idea if they offered it as a libation or not, then we're going to be much more lenient. You can see why there's reason to be lenient there, and even yayin b'yayin is going to be permitted. Okay, now permitted, obviously, right? Permitted, like Rabban Shimon Gamliel, you still can't drink it, right? But it's permitted to benefit from, as long as you deduct the price of the wine and you don't get any benefit from it. Okay, now we're going to move on to Amud. On Amud, we're going to start this topic, which is going to really take us to the end of the Masechet. Perhaps we'll address it at the Siyum, why the Masechet ends with all these topics of koshering wine presses, and then we're going to get into koshering dishes and koshering mikvah, right? Sometimes those two things kind of get confused, and we'll see in the upcoming dapim, starting tomorrow, why there's a little confusion between them, whereas they all really come from the same section in the Torah, and there's a little confusion as to where everything's learned from. So you're going to see that even in the sugya itself, there's some confusion between koshering and mikvah. Okay, so that's going to be how we're going to end our Masechet Avodah Zarah, which makes sense because kelim of non-Jews. But we're going to start with, and I'll already preface this sugya by saying the reality of our Mishnah is quite complex and unclear. And whenever I want to know about reality, I open Mishnah Eretz Yisrael, which I mentioned a number of times. You can find it in Hebrew and Sefaria. It's not yet translated as far as I know. It'd be a huge operation, so I don't know if it's going to be translated, but hope so. It's a fabulous book because it's an academic book where they take the Mishnah. So if you look in Sefaria under each Mishnah, you won't find it in the page of the Gemara, but you'll find it under commentaries on the Mishnah. And there, the commentary there written by Safrai is basically trying to understand sometimes the reality and also comparative sources of Tosefta, Mishnah, Braitot, Yerushalmi, Bavli, different approaches, kind of summarizing them and also trying to bring reality. So it's a very long commentary here because there's a lot. What Safrai points out is the reality that the Mishnah discusses and the way the commentaries and even the Gemara understands it, and also the later commentaries, seems to not really match reality. And there's some issues here about, we're going to talk about pitch that they would put that they would line the bottom of the wine press with. He says, I've spoken to many people in wine presses and that would ruin the wine. Nobody would ever do that. He suggests perhaps we're talking not about pitch, but we're talking about sap, and that sap would actually add a better flavor. But what the connection here and the reality, there's a lot of questions. So I'm going to try to explain it the way Rashi explains it, because that's just an easier way to go, even though it's not necessarily the absolute truth of what's going on here in the sugya. So my qualification here to the next part of today's stuff, that there's definitely a lot of questions here and things that are not so clear. And you'll see as we go on where there's really a lack of clarity. God shall Evan. So we have a wine press. We're going to talk about wine presses made of different materials. So some are made of stone. Okay, that makes sense. That's probably the majority of them are stone. Shesfata ove kochavim. Zefet is usually pitch. Okay, that it was lined with pitch by an idolater. Minagva vihi Torah. You do something called niguv. Niguv literally means to dry, but that's not what it means here. Okay, like a magevet is a towel, comes from niguv, but that's not what we're talking about at all. The Gemara is going to later say, we're going to get to this at the very end of today's sugya. It's a method of cleaning using water and ashes. The ashes was a cleanser. Okay, we don't usually think of it that way, but that was one of the things they used, the cleanser. And if we go back to sugya we learned much, much earlier in the Masechet, we talked about koshering jugs that had wine in them, and we said if they were machnisola kiyum, if you keep them in there like jugs for a long time, then they need a process to remember of the water changing it 3 times for 3 24-hour periods called miloi ve'iroi, filling it and then dumping it, filling it, dumping it, filling it, dumping it. And then we had things like cups, which the wine's not in there for very long, and since it's cold, you're not really worried. That just needs rinsing. We call that hadacha. This is an in-between because we have this in-between situation. Now, what is the in-between situation? It's a good question. It's in the wine press and there's tar in there. Okay, now what happened in this situation, again, we're going to understand this at least according to this, the way Rashi and the Gemara is going to go with this, that we have a got belonging to a Jew. It's a wine press of a Jew. Then you hire, or you had a Gentile around, they lined it with this pitch or sap or something. Now, what does this have to do with wine? There's no wine in there yet. Okay, they didn't tread on the grapes in there yet. So the issue Rashi says is, in the first Rashi on the page, because the pitch, now Rashi understood this really as pitch, has a bad taste, a bad smell, a bad odor. They would pour wine in, part of the process of lining it with pitch. Again, this is questionable, but this is what Rashi says, because they're trying to figure out what does this have to do with wine. If they come to my wine press, line it with pitch, what is that? What's the problem? There's no wine in there. So there must be wine in the process of lining it with pitch, and therefore, and because, now this is going to be an in-between. It's not as lenient as the cup because first of all, they put it a few times possibly, or they leave the wine in there for a certain amount of time in order to have it get out the bad odor, assuming we're going with the odor issue. And it's not as serious as the kadim, which stays in for a very long time. So you can do an immediate solution, but it requires more than just rinsing. Okay, you need to do this afer, this ashes with it, the niguv, what it's called. And then it's tohora, and then you're fine. Tohora here means kosher. Okay, even though tahor and tamei often means impurity, we're going to get back, we're going to compare tomorrow, or I forget if it's tomorrow or the next day, but the issues of purity and impurity and nesech, issues of koshering and purifying. But right now they mean, and it's kosher. Vishal eitz, what if it was done with wood? Okay, so first of all, Safrai points out that in places in Europe and other places like not in Israel, where the wine season is in the summer where it could rain, they had to make some presses inside so it wouldn't get ruined from the rain, right? In Israel, you don't have to worry about rain in the summer season. But some places they did them indoors, and that's why they made some with wood. Okay, and then they would do it with wood. Anyway, Rebbe Omer Ginageh v'chachamim omrim yiklaf et hazefet. So here we have a machloket. Rebbe says niguv is enough. It's the same as with the stone. The rabbis say you have to actually take off the zefet. Now, why is wood any different? So there's different opinions. One says that they would need to put more zefet on, and therefore, because they put more of the pitch on, they needed more wine. Because they have more wine, they needed more of a process. Or maybe, it's unclear exactly what the difference is. We're going to see in a bright that they don't actually think there's a difference. So that also begs even more questions, but you have to actually take the zefet off. You have to take it off. You have to wonder why you put it on if you're going to take it off, right? But I guess it means you have to do it yourself. If an idolater did it, you have a problem. Okay, you have to get rid of all the zefet. By the way, why were they lining this with something? Probably so things didn't slip in between cracks, or right. It's also not so clear why they were lining these. B'shel cheres, Okay, now if it's made of earthenware, now we assume we're talking about the gat, the wine press. That was our topic. So Safrai points out you don't make wine presses out of cheres. Cheres is very easily breakable, and you're treading on grapes. It doesn't make sense. So he says maybe they're talking about implements of the wine press and not necessarily the wine press itself. Right? This is just begging questions upon questions upon questions about this Mishnah. At some point he claims maybe there's a problem with the Mishnah and the way it was passed down, and it was talking about other things. It's difficult. So here a cheres, even peeling away the zephet is enough because we learned already. Cheres, remember the cheres hadriani, they would take out to war with them, right? It was very, very absorbent. So that wouldn't be able to be koshered in this manner, right? Peeling the zephet wouldn't help. Amarava. Okay, and then the question is, what would help? Maybe the soaking for 3 days, right? Maybe not. Okay, it's not clear. The Mishnah also just doesn't tell you the whole story. If it's forbidden, what does it mean? What stage more do you need? Amarava. So now Rava comes, and we're going to have two versions of Rava. Rashi claims they don't contradict. They're actually talking about different things. So again, we'll read it according to Rashi. Amarava, dafka zifata. Notice the Mishnah says that you put pitch on it. But if it was darachba, lo. But what if you had your god, your wine press, made of stone, and an idolater came and treaded on the grapes with you? Then you wouldn't need. All you would need to do was rinse it out. Okay, if it didn't have, we weren't talking about the tarring process. We're just talking about the treading. It would be fine. To which the Gemara says, pshita. That's obvious. All you need to do is rinse it out. Why is it obvious? Because it says you put pitch in it. Obviously, we weren't talking about what we weren't talking about. Why are you bringing this up? Well, ma'u detema hu adina filu darachba. V'hayt katani zfata orcha demilta katani kamashmalan. What would be more likely, that you would bring an idolater to do the work of putting the pitch in your gut, or that you would bring an idolater to tread on the grapes with you, right? Now, we've been learning about yayin nesech. You wouldn't really want to bring an idolater to tread on grapes, even though we did see cases of that, but that's not a typical case. But it is typical that you need a worker to do the pitch, and there's some wine involved, but it's something that theoretically you're not really involved in the wine processing, the making of the wine. So it was more typical that Jews would bring idolaters to put the pitch in, and that's why the Mishnah, you might have thought, the Mishnah picked a case that was a typical case and not an atypical case. But maybe it would be true if they tried it on your grapes as well, you would still need niguv. Kamash v'lan, that's why Rabban needs to tell us no. It's much easier to clean it out if it's just that they treaded grapes, but not that they put the pitch in. And what we're talking about is when you have a wine press that has no pitch in it, okay, or whatever it might be, whether it's, let's just call it zephet, however we're going to determine what zephet is, whether it's pitch or sap. But if it has nothing in it, it wasn't lined at all, and they just tread it on your grapes, all you need to do is rinse it out. Now, ikeda amre, some people say that amarava dafka zifata abal darachma lo sagila beniguf. Specifically, the Mishnah says if you lined it with pitch, the idolater, but if you trampled on it, now Rashi adds here, if it had pitch lined in it, and then you added, and then the idolater treaded on the grapes, that wouldn't be enough to do niguv. You would need more. And why is that? Good question. Perhaps because it's more sticky a little bit, right? Think about it. The wine would get absorbed more into it, even though theoretically, the reason why people would put pitch might be actually so it doesn't get absorbed in, right? And in fact, they put, what Safrai does claim is that pitch was used often in jugs to make sure that in case there's a crack, nothing comes out, okay? But the other problem with the pitch, which we're going to see later, is once there's the pitch in there, or whatever it is that's lining, once there's this lining, there could be cracks in the lining. And once there's a crack in the lining, the wine could get underneath, and actually it won't come out if you just rinse it. So that could be what the issue is here. And therefore, niguv is not enough, to which the Gemara says, pshita, that's obvious. Zifatatnan, it says zifata. Obviously, it doesn't say en darachba. So isn't that obvious what Rav is saying? That if darachba, you would obviously need more. Well, Mao did him at the same thing now. They're going to say the same as the first lashon of Rava. You might have thought huadinda filu darachba haid katani sfata or chadimata katani. You might have thought, right? Also, yeah, it would be obvious. It would be the same thing if it was lined and then treaded on. But haid katani zafta or chadimata katani. But again, it was unlikely that you were going to have the idolater tread on the grapes with you, and therefore they picked the typical case, didn't mention the atypical case. and therefore you might have thought it's both, right? But therefore, kamash malan, that's why they teach you dafka zapata. That's why Rava wanted to tell you it's only if it was lined with pitch only by the idolater, but if also aval darachba lo sagele benigu. But if the idolater treaded on the grapes with when the pitch was already lined and then treaded on the grapes, it wouldn't be enough to do niguv. You would need to do more. Right, probably now. What more? Maybe the eroy, right? Letting it sit for 24 hours in water, changing the water, etc. And we're going to have a story that highlights this. This is a fun story because you get to see Rav in a bit of a different light. We usually see Rav as a big gadol. Here, Rav is an errand boy for his uncle Rabbi Chia. Okay, and Rabbi Chia sends him. This is like the classic. You want to cost your kitchen for Pesach, and you don't want to do it yourself, right? You go to the local yeshiva, say, "Bring me some yeshiva guys." So this is what they did. Somebody came before Rabbi Chia. Amarle havli gavra dedachele martzarta. Please bring me someone who can kosher who can purify my wine press. Amarle Rav. So he goes to Rav, his nephew, who was young at the time, obviously. Zil bahadei, go with him. And make sure that they don't scream at me in the Beit Midrash. In other words, do a good job, do a thorough job. I don't want to get in trouble with this later. So Rav goes, he sees it's very smooth. Okay, it looks good, the lining of the tar or the pitch, whatever it is in the sap. Amar havadai beniguv sagilai says this for sure. It's enough just to do the niguv process with the ashes and the water. But as he's going along and cleaning this, he sees a big crack in there. And he sees underneath the crack there's a lot of wine collected there. Amar halo sagele benigov elabekilov. He says this is not going to be enough. And here we see if you don't do nigov, what are you going to do? It's not just enough what I said to do the iroi miloi and all that. Now we're going to see it. Kiluf. You have to peel away. Okay, we saw this in the Mishna. Yikluf dazefet. You have to peel away all of the lining and then rinse it all out. Okay, so you have to do that first. And then he understands. He says, now I get what my uncle said to me. Do it a good job, right? Make sure you're being very careful here because there could be cracks and the wine will get collected. So he figured it out. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to bring a contradictory braita. So the braita says, Hagat v'hamachatz v'mashpech. Okay, the gat seems to be either utensils used in the gat, okay, which seems to be because we're going to assume everyone assumes we're talking about cheres here, earthenware vessels, which again, gats weren't made of earthenware. So that and a ladle and a funnel, shalovdei kochavim, these were all implements used in the wine process, right? Either making it or ladling it out later. Rebbe matir b'niguv v'chachamim oslim. So Rebbe permits niguv, which we're going to see. Wait, we said niguv wasn't good enough. Okay, we're going to get back to that. And the rabbis forbid, right? This contradicts the last line in our Mishnah, which said if it's cheres, even if you peel away the zefet, it's still forbidden, right? Niguv for sure is not enough. So we're going to have to question Rebbe from that. Why does Rebbe permit? And the rabbis forbid. Rebbe agrees, though. These are just implements, but he's more strict when it comes to the kankanim. Okay, and what's the difference between the bottles, the jugs, and the implements? This is what we learned before. The jugs, the wine stays in for a long time, and that's why niguv is not enough. You have to do the miloi v'iroi, right? Leave it for 3 periods of 24 hours, and that's all because it's cold. Okay, like I said, we're going to get back to koshering and how you kosher things. V'shel etz v'shel even yinagev. If it's wood or it's stone, then you do niguv, which is again the ashes and the water. Now this is all without the zefet. The braita starts off, right? Our braita started off with the zefet and then went to if it doesn't have zefet. This is specifically, or it didn't really talk about much about without zefet. This talks about without zefet, and then it says v'ima yumazu papin asulin. Now the eitz and the even, if they were with zefet, they'd be forbidden, meaning you can't do niguv. Now that completely contradicts our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah say? With zefet, they do niguv, right? With eitz, there's a question. Yina gave you klofet hazefet. And then it sounded like you don't even need anything if there's nothing on it, right? So this is completely contradictory to our Mishnah. So v'hatznan, doesn't it say, Gachel Evan Shiz Patau Ve'Kochavim Minagvavi Torah? So why do they say niguv doesn't work if they're mezupapin in the Braita? It contradicts our Mishnah. So they say matnitin. Now they answer it back to the second reading of Rava, which is matnitin de lo darachba, Braita de darachba. The Braita is talking about if they're mezupapin and the idolater treaded on the grapes, then they're forbidden. And the only thing you could do is, again, and Rashi adds here, even though it doesn't say, what does it mean, asurin? Yiklov, which is what we saw in the Mishnah, right? You can, if they were right, then you can basically peel off the layer of the lining and clean it out, and then you're fine. Okay, but the Bright is talking about if they were mezupapin and they treaded on it, even though it didn't say that in the Braita, right? That's the way they resolve. Again, the Braita could be a different version and a different opinion, but the Gemara likes to put the two kind of sources together and try to work them out. So say they were talking about different situations. Amar, by the way, again, going back to Safrai and what I said in the beginning, there's confusion, right? You can see here that there's different versions, there's different opinions, and it just adds to the confusion of it. And the Babli's approach is let's put them all together and make them all work, but it's not necessarily always the emet lamito, the absolute truth. Amar, Hagat v'hamachatz, another point now in this Braita we're going to deal with, which I mentioned as we read it. The Gat v'hamachatz v'hamashpech shel avdei kochavim, which is the cheres, the earthenware. Rebbe matir b'niguv v'chachamim oschim. Right, so Rebbe says niguv works. The rabbis say it doesn't, but Rebbe says it works. V'hanan snan shel cheres afal pishkalaf dezefet harezu asura. But the Mishnah says it doesn't help. You can peel off the zefet, that still doesn't work. So for sure, niguv is not enough. So I'm Sefer de Manitin Atan Rabbanit. Rava says, oh, don't worry about that. That last line of the Braita just matches the Rabbi's opinion, and they don't bother mentioning Rebbe, which is, again, a weak answer. Why is it a weak answer? Because the Mishnah earlier mentioned when there's a machloket Rebbe and the rabbis. So if there's a machloket Rebbe and the rabbis about this, why wouldn't the Mishnah mention it? It's a good question. Okay, but that's, again, if you want to make everything harmonious, so then you can say that. Darash Rava. Now, Darash is a bit of a different language used usually. Derive usually means this is what they taught people to do. Na'ava artifu. If you want to kosher a god, you should you should boil water in it. Okay, now what does it mean boil water in it? Okay, we'll talk about this in a minute, but it sounds like you can't really have a pot boiling, right? You can't really boil the water in the wine press. Try to imagine, right? A wine press is like a, flat area. It's not exactly a place to be boiling water. So what they seem to say is pour boiling water over it. Now, why would you need to pour boiling water if you could do niguv, right? The afer and the mayin. So basically, most of the commentaries think that Rav is offering an alternative. This is a different way. You can do, and he doesn't disagree with the Mishnah. The Mishnah gives its way of doing it. But he says another way to do it is to pour boiling water in it. Okay, that would work also. Now, there's a fascinating sugya which connects with the sugya in Masechet Shabbat, and I just wanted to mention this, that Tosfot brings up here. There's a very big machloket in Masechet Shabbat about, okay, if you know kli rishon, kli sheni, right? There's kli rishon that's on the fire, and then you pour from there into another kli. That's a kli sheni, okay? And kli sheni doesn't cook the way a kli rishon does, and kli shlishi doesn't cook like sheni. That's how you make coffee and tea. There's all these discussions how you do it. There's a big debate whether iorei kli rishon, when you pour from the kli rishon, can you pour it when you pour water onto something? Like let's say you pour onto your coffee beans. Is that like cooking it in the kli rishon, the pouring of it into the first kli? Or is it already removed from the fire and therefore, right, removed from the, even if it's not even on the fire, but removed from the original pot that it was cooked in, which is the kli rishon, and now it's already, like a kli sheni. So that's a big question. And it's a big debate between Rabbeinu Tam and the Rashbam, and their sources from here. Rabbeinu Tam says, what do you see from here? If you can pour boiling water into the gat, which must be what they're talking about, because how can you boil it in the gat? Then, and it works to kasher, then it must be iorei kli rishon, you're pouring it from the vessel where you boil the water, is the same as the vessel itself, the kli rishon. And that's what he wants to say, the iorei kli rishon, you have to be strict about when it comes to cooking on Shabbat, because iorei kli rishon is like a kli rishon. You can be lenient here and say we can use it to kasher, because it's got the same halachot of the kli rishon. After for Shabbat, it's the opposite. If it has the same laws, then you can't do things with an iorei kli rishon. And the Rashbam says, no, this is totally different than regular. So you don't need to boil the water in the gat because you're only koshering it from cold. It was only used for cold. So boiling from a kli rishon, pouring from a kli rishon, which is really like a kli sheni according to the Rashbam, works here because it's cold, because it was only messed up by cold. It was used for wine. So because of that, we can be lenient. We don't need the same boiling that we need, let's say, if we boiled water in the first place. So that's a big machloket, right? Iur kli rishon, that's all based on our sugi here. And the other interesting part is that Rabbeinu Hananel somehow claims that there's a way to boil it inside, and this has nothing to do with that sugya then. And it was actually, you could boil the water, like boil it under. I didn't understand exactly the reality, but Rabbeinu Hananel does have a way that he thinks it was actually, he's talking about boiling it inside the god. So it's an interesting side point. Okay, two more things for the sugya, and then we'll finish. Rava kiyava mishader gulfe laharpanya. Rabba would send empty jugs. This is a bit of a different issue, but it has to do with, again, the concern for an idolatry using your jugs for their wine. You want to send empty jugs or empty kegs to Harpanya. Okay, you wanted to send them to the city. And he sent them with messengers that were idolaters or Gentiles. So what did he do? He didn't want them to use it at all. He would turn them upside down, put them in a bag and seal the bag. And that was what we called, we've seen this again before, chotam to chotam. It's like two seals. And then he wasn't worried that anyone would use them. Now, kasaval, now, in this case, what did we say about jugs and kegs? The wine stays in there for a long time. Now here, even if the idolater used it, it wouldn't stay in there for a long time because they were a messenger. They were just bringing it from place to place. So comes the Gemara and says, he held that kol davar shemechniso lekiyum, since potentially it could have been left here for the long term, even though it wouldn't have in these particular, but other jugs and other kegs, it could be left in for a long time. Afilu lefi sha'ah gazru barabanan, that the rabbis forbade it, even if in that situation particularly, it wasn't going to end up being there for a long time, but they forbade it anyway, and that's why he did this double seal to prevent them from using it at all. If they'd used it, it wouldn't have been a big deal. You just have to rinse it out because it wasn't used for a long time. But they didn't want to have a situation where someone would see him rinsing them out and say, oh, well, mine that had wine in there for a long time of Gentiles, I can do that too, and therefore he was strict. Now we get to Bamem and Agvan, and we'll see this sugya all the more tomorrow, but we'll start it. Rav Amar b'mayim, Rav Bar Bachana Amar b'efer. Rav says we use water, Rav Bar Bachana says we use ashes. Now, this is all just what is niguk that I mentioned in the Mishna. So Rav Amar b'mayim below b'efer. Wait a minute. Can't be that Rav said water and not ashes. Of course you need the ashes because how you're cleaning it. Otherwise, we just call it hadacha, rinsing with water. This is obviously something different and something more. Can't possibly be. And Rav Bar Bachana Amar b'efer below b'mayim. Okay, you ever try to soap up something? You obviously need water. What? You need ashes, no water? So, Ela Rav Amar b'mayim v'hu adin la'efer, Rav Bar Bachana Amar la'efer v'hu adin l'mayim. Okay, basically we're going to say they both meant both. Each one just brought up the first part of the process. And lo pligi, they actually don't disagree. We'll talk about this more tomorrow. But if the gut was already wet, this is just simple logic. You put in first the cleanser because it's already wet, and then you do the water. If you start with dry, then you have to put water in first, and then you put the ashes. Now, obviously, you need water at the end, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. But basically, there's really no machloket. Okay, with that, we finished. So what do we have in today's daf? We started with these are the things that are forbidden and forbidden b'kolshu, not batel at all. What are they? What were the criteria to get them into the Mishnah? We discussed that. Then we got to the what do you do if it gets mixed up, and can you sell it? Rashbag, who held his heter where? And we finished with how do you kosher different materials, gots with made of different materials with zephet in them, and what are the different methods of koshering, and what issues do we have machlokot? And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov.